Hello, everybody, and welcome to our panel. I'm Tina Luongo, and I'm the attorney in charge of the criminal defense practice at the Legal Aid Society in New York City. A year ago, almost to the moment, the lives of our clients as public defenders, the communities that serve, and in fact, all of us, our world turned upside down with the pandemic. And as we pivoted and moved to remote, to moving inside, to distancing ourselves from our workplaces, our educational systems, our families, in the heart of it were clients trapped between systems. And for public defenders, that often means clients being trapped in incarcerational settings. So today's panel, I'm joined by chief defenders, both in the state and federal systems, to talk about the role that public defenders play and have played during not only the crisis of COVID, but the crisis of racial unrest in our country, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. So let's introduce our panel. I've asked them to spend a moment just introducing themselves and their experience and the office they work in, and then we'll get right to our conversation. So I'm going to kick it over to Cydni.
Hello, my name is Cydni Sanchez, and I join you from the Southwest. I am in New Mexico at the law offices of the public defender. I joined the department right after graduating law school about 15 years ago. With the department, I've represented a variety of clients on a variety of charges, from misdemeanors up to serious violent offenses. I've been a supervisor, a managing attorney. I currently serve as the deputy chief public defender and I oversee administrative operations, including training and recruitment, HR, litigation, our budget, and IT. So thank you for having me.
Thanks. Hey, AJ.
Thanks, Tina. I'm AJ Kramer. I'm the federal public defender in Washington, D.C., where, of course, not much is happening nowadays. I have been the federal public defender in D.C. since the office opened in 1990. And before that, I was in federal public defender offices in Sacramento and San Francisco for a number of years, which all that adds up to I'm very old. This pandemic in the past year or so has been quite the dramatic change in our practice. So thank you all for putting this program on and for inviting me to be here. But all I've ever been is a federal public defender. So that's the extent of my knowledge, the federal system.
Stan.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stan Hedman. I'm the executive director of New York County Defender Services in New York City. While Tina's office represents our clients citywide, it's a citywide office. My office operates exclusively in the borough of Manhattan. I started out as a staff attorney at the Legal Aid Society in 1995. I went into private practice in 2003, where I litigated mostly in federal court, but always doing criminal defense work. And I've been the executive director since 2015.
I'm going to stay with you, Stan, for this first question, which is, tell us about the role your team at New York County has played this year in trying to uplift the right to counsel while we've been dealing with the pandemic, the protests, and national unrest.
So I think the first shout out doesn't go to the lawyers or the social workers or the investigators. It goes to our IT team. I mean, when things shut down, New York City criminal courts operated at that time like it was the 19th century. There was no e-filing. There was no email communication between the courts and our offices. Nothing was remote. I remember early on in Manhattan being told that the courthouse had 2 laptops available to make things virtual. So we were caught completely unprepared for this. And our IT team just did an amazing job getting every lawyer, every social worker, every investigator, everybody in the office ready to transition to a world that we thought would only last a couple of months. And here we are a year later doing it. But really our focus when this first happened really turned to our incarcerated clients. I mean, if you just think that at that time, nobody was wearing masks, nobody was being asked to wear masks, the kind of congregate setting and the dorm layout that Rikers Island has for most of our incarcerated clients, that's where our biggest concern was. And so we immediately started a campaign to file writs of habeas corpuses to get out our vulnerable incarcerated clients. And really what we saw was that at the beginning, March, April, and kind of a little bit into May, we were having a lot of success. About 56% of the writs that our attorneys filed were granted by judges. Unfortunately, as time has gone on and the jail population plummeted in New York City by about 40%, what we've seen is a gradual increase in our jail population. And if you look at our writ success over the last year, it's only 23%. So judges definitely, pivoted after the middle of May. They really stopped granting a lot of these writs, but we certainly are continuing to fight that fight. And, as we've dealt with the second wave and some folks are talking about a third wave, we certainly have continued that battle.
Thanks. Cydni, to you, I think we all shout out our IT teams, but you also talked about sort of part of your job as a deputy is training your, staff. Talk about this remote and this pivot and the effect it has had on your staff. And what are some of the ways you've been able to overcome the challenges presented, and in ways maybe you haven't that are really eye-opening to you?
Well, I think the biggest impact, certainly on the staff and most directly on the clients, has been the attorney-client relationship. Because everything is virtual and all of the obstacles in having our attorneys communicate directly with the clients, whether that be through broken phone conversations or trying to get through to them at the jail and getting the prisons and jails to set up phone conferences or video conferences, it's really been an obstacle. As we all know, developing that rapport with clients early on is incredibly important. And being in this virtual world where it's virtual, first of all, but you cannot do anything in person, has been incredibly stressful for the attorneys and for the clients. Right, it's very challenging to develop the rapport, but communicating in general is a huge challenge. So one of the things that we've been working on is we've worked with all the different counties since we're a statewide system. We have 13 different offices, right? We're in every county in some capacity, and trying to get the jails and prisons to provide new means to communicate. Whether that's new phones or additional video conferencing options. Our trials have reopened now since February. So now we're struggling with how to get clients transported so they can actually meet with attorneys in person prior to trial. So those are some of the challenges that we've been dealing with.
How about you, AJ? I mean, is it the same in the federal system where you've had to pivot or because of some of the framework of the federal system, for instance, electronic filing, did it make that a little bit easier? But what's your thoughts as you're hearing our colleagues from the state system as to the system you've been practicing in, and also to sort of this question comes to mind. We all think that remote practice is absolutely horrible, but are there pieces of it that you have found you have been able to make work as best as possible?
So yeah, the federal, it's remarkable to me how the federal system transitioned so quickly. And again, as Stan said, due to the IT folks, from a system where everything was in person almost, with exceptions, to all of a sudden, nothing was in person. And especially in our district, in every district in the country was different how much they shut down and for how long. Our district is still almost all remote virtual court proceedings. So you're absolutely right, though. We did have the advantage of the ECF electronic filing system in the federal courts. So we were already used to filing everything remotely and electronically. I mean, almost nothing's filed in paper. So that makes that easier. But the transition to the totally remote system with the problems that Cydni and Stan have talked about are the same in the federal system of not seeing your clients in person. It's actually remarkable to me that the system is working as well as it is, frankly. Without that, it seems to me to be very troubling in many ways. But the one thing you asked about, how it has made at least in a lot of places, and I'll speak for DC, the jail where the vast majority of our clients are held, DC jail, pretty quickly, with help from the district court, the prosecutors, our office, it actually was it's one of the few times everybody seems to be working towards the same goal for everybody. Established, they sent the district court sent laptops over to the jail for video conferences. The jail set up video conference rooms for their attorney-client calls as well as for court appearances. So it was, again, the speed and the scope of it was quite remarkable. I think one of the things, Tina, that so the jail had no video visiting before that by lawyers. You couldn't from your desk. You could go up. There was no capability and no phone calls really or anything. The one good thing, which meant that even to go, if your client's court appearance was postponed, not by you even, but by somebody, you had to go to the jail to let them know for like a 30-second visit and say your next court appearance is postponed, and you would go to the jail. You might see obviously more people, but one of the things that it's great for that, that you can now talk to your client and say your court appearance, virtual court appearance, has been postponed for 2 weeks. Okay, thanks. And that 30-second conversation, now you don't have to leave your office, wherever your office is. The flip side of that is I'm afraid that some of the court accommodations for virtual appearances will be, courts seem quite happy with it too. So that's the flip side of that coin. But it is great that jail's established. Now, whether it'll stick afterwards, that's the big question about, will we be able to contact our clients pretty easily for something that really you don't need to go to the jail for. And actually, even some of it they've established so that you can share the documents with them on the computer. Again, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm saying it's a good thing under the circumstances that they adapted so well.
Yeah. We're having this conversation a little bit, I think, in Stan, I'm reminiscent of the conversation we were having the other day at a meeting we were at about this very thing. This idea that look, the system, the court systems may think it is in fact more efficient, more effective. You don't have to transport people for a whole host of reasons. The other thing that's happening and what that means, sort of balancing the efficiency versus due process, the fact that the client has the right to come, the fact that if you move to virtual, you take the public away from the need for the public to safeguard the protections of having the public watch what happens in our courts. Family members coming to stand in solidarity and be with their loved ones. And we are also having this conversation, and I'm going to turn to you, Stan, to sort of bring this perspective of the debate about our out clients. Isn't it easier for them too to simply not come to court for, so Stan, talk about that, because you raised that as a concern as a chief.
Yeah, so I think, certainly internally in my office, there's division. There are some on the leadership team who feel adamantly that, the client and the lawyer should be together, present for every court appearance. Sometimes offers are made, things happen in the moment. That's incredibly important. They feel that just that interaction with the client is important and shouldn't be lost. I think where I personally fall, I think it's a mixed bag. I think clearly there are things that have to be done in person. First appearance has to be done in person. Pleas, hearings, trials, grand jury proceedings, all of these things have to be done in person. But what we've also seen during the pandemic that, pre-pandemic, for a 3-minute court appearance where you knew ahead of time that nothing was going to happen and the case was going to get adjourned, our clients in New York City would have to wake up at 6 a.m, get on a train, go through security, sit in a courtroom for hours, get yelled at by court officers because they're on their phones. The case gets called, you get in there, case adjourned, a 2-minute conversation with the lawyer afterwards, and now you got to go all the way back home. And so, why can't we do those kind of proceedings remotely, right? I mean, I have clients now that are stepping out from work, right? Remoting in, dealing with it for 10 or 15 minutes and then going right back to work. Or if you have childcare issues. And so I think we have to balance what we think is quote unquote efficient from the perspective of our clients, right? And what we adamantly, have to draw the line in the sand and make sure that there are just some proceedings that have to be in person, that a lawyer needs to be standing right next to their clients. And I think that's the debate that we're all going to have both internally and with the courts.
I want to turn a little bit to the challenges emotionally in terms of workload, change of workload, the isolation of working remote. Cydni, you're shaking your head. How has this affected staff? And what were some of the things you had to put in play as a deputy statewide to be able to make sure we were supporting teams?
Well, isolation, I think, is a true issue for all of our staff across the board. What we're seeing that it has the biggest impact, certainly it seems like in our core staff who are not coming into office, is because the attorneys often have more interaction with each other. They're going to court hearings, even if they're virtually, they're having some kind of contact with other people pretty regularly. But for the core staff, I think it's been a particular challenge for them. It's required us to really shift how frequently I think that we meet. It used to be different in the office, right? You run into each other or you make those calls, whereas now we have to be more intentional in the meetings that we schedule to make sure that people are all on the same page, to make sure people are sharing information, but that we're supporting each other as well. So I know our chief and one of our other deputy chiefs have been having regular meetings with some of their leaders. I have regular meetings with all of our leaders, but that has been, I think, one of the biggest stressors for them. The other thing I wanted to mention is on the workload piece, right? I know that in a virtual world, there's a lot of benefits, which Stan mentioned, right? Limiting the time that we're spending on the road, traveling, commuting. But the downfall to that is that it takes so much longer to have some of the virtual hearings, right? You're waiting for the judge to go through the docket, you're trying to get in with the client, then there's a mishap. And so things seem to take longer, which I know is increasing the workload for the attorneys, right? Instead of having that 5-minute conversation with the DA and a 10-minute conversation with your client, now you're trying to balance being in the court and then calling and getting in contact separately. Things do take much longer in a virtual world.
Yeah. And then there's the merging of the worlds, right? The professional and the home, especially for so many of our staff that work taking care of kids doing remote, or I can't tell you how many times, right? My twins would jump into that. I actually think somebody took a screenshot of my son sitting on my shoulders while I'm in the middle of a meeting. Both it humanized, I think, and connected people in different ways. But let's face it, it wasn't easy. AJ, I saw you wanted to sort of step in. You were shaking your head. Talk about your staff. How have you had to make some changes around supporting staff?
Yeah, I mean, sure, it's a problem. One problem is it's expensive I know it's been expensive to me. We have internet boosters all over our house now to accommodate everybody who needs to be online all day, including me. And there's problems with bandwidth with people and some of the virtual appearances, but we have a Zoom meeting once a week. We're not that big an office, so that but it's and of course there's a lot of email traffic back, and there's way more email traffic back and forth about things. I think that's exactly as Cydni and Stan said. People feel somewhat isolated because you're home or not in the office. I actually come into the office a lot, and there's almost nobody here most of the time, which is wonderful. I'm not getting phone calls or people coming in, but there's a lot of email traffic that goes back and forth. So I think it's very important. It's hard for the staff to who are and when most of the schools around here are virtual, so they're home and they're trying to deal with kids on trying to do attend school at the same time, and it's a very difficult balancing act and very stressful for folks. There's no question about it. And for clients, there's important things like going over a pre-sentence report or going over a plea agreement that's been sent. And ordinarily you'd be sitting there and you'd be going over every word with them and sitting there and explaining it. And then you only have an hour, say, on your time with the video system with the jail. And you're trying to explain words and the client has questions, and a pre-sentence report can be 40, 50 pages. And it's extremely difficult to get that done. So there's the pressures at home and the pressures of trying to get with your clients and go over things properly. Absolutely.
Yeah. Stan.
And
Yeah.
I would add, one of my biggest concerns very early on was office morale. I mean, so much about being a public defender is coming back from court and complaining about what just happened and seeking advice and popping into people's offices, being mentored by senior attorneys in the office, where you can just go in and ask a question. And all of that has been lost. And, I worry about retention of young lawyers, right? Who maybe, came to this work to be mentored and be in New York City. And now they can't go to restaurants. They're locked in their 350 square foot apartments for hours and hours, and what impact that would have on all of the offices long term. I think public defenders, more than other offices, that fabric of coming together is incredibly unique, and we've lost that over the last year.
I think about, and then we'll turn to the next really critical, important topic about.
Can I say something, Tina?
Summer, yeah. Go ahead, Adrian.
In that regard, I'm sorry.
No,
also,
go ahead.
I completely agree with Stan, and it's a real problem. But also, there's the whole part about it's for our office. Everything happens in one courthouse that's a few blocks away, and the probation office is there, the clerk's office is there. So you go over for a court appearance, and you drop into the probation officer to talk about a case that's there. You run into a prosecutor on the elevator, you talk about a case for 5 minutes and get the discovery straightened out or a plea agreement. You go to the clerk's office to check on some documents, although you can do that easy, but you're in the building and you see folks every day, and these conversations that take place, just like Stan said, going back to the office and the camaraderie and the consoling and everything. Same thing in the courthouse. Now you have to try to get the person by email or on the phone, and it's sometimes very difficult. Whereas one trip to the courthouse could take care of problems in 3 or 4 cases sometimes.
Yeah. I was also sort of, the thing that we were talking about, like online training. Sure, you can train. Zoom allows us to do lots of things. We're all in Zoom and Teams and Skype. But you know what, where we learned most, I certainly learned most, was watching my colleague cross-examine, or watching my colleague do voir dire, or watching a trial. And and then going and trying to put my own spin on it as a young public defender. That's sort of gone. So when I'm thinking about how do we begin to think through professional development, I had a new class start in the trial offices 3 months before we went out. They were just starting to go to court after training. And then I had a new class start just this fall in the middle of this. And what I hear them say is, sure, I can watch on Zoom, but I'm being trained, but am I getting my skills to be able to practice? I want to pivot, to use that word again, to a really serious topic, and one that I think public defenders have certainly not just this year been on the front lines and in the breach on, which is the racism, systemic racism in the criminal legal system and in the community and all the systems that sort of bring our clients to the criminal legal system, and specifically around policing, and talk about this summer. The summer we witnessed yet more violence against Black and brown people at the hand of law enforcement. We also saw a national uprising in response to that, to demand change. What role has your office played locally? And what role does our profession play nationally in this conversation of a racial equity that has to happen, potentially in talking about the defunding of police or a reinvestment in community? I'm going to start off, Cydni, with you, and then go to Stan, and then we'll bring it to AJ.
Okay. So I think that our role, both locally and nationally, is that what's unique to us as public defenders is we obviously draw people who are dedicated to indigent defense and making a difference. What I see is those people are invested in making a difference in the lives of individuals. And that's why we come to do this, right? We want to work with people one-on-one, and we want to help them, not just with their legal issues, but right, any other underlying issues. What has been inspiring for me and what I've seen in our department is that there's been more of a collective, a goal of putting the voices together and having our voices be louder together, instead of just on the individual cases, but on the bigger issues, right? Whether it's lapel cameras for all the police officers, or trying to convince the legislature to reinvest, right? Instead of funding solely in law enforcement, but reinvesting in mental health resources, in healthcare, and all of that. And so I think that that is where we can make an impact, and where our profession can actually make an impact, is using our voices together. And I think in our community in particular in New Mexico, again, the focus I feel has been more individual, and on certain levels, this has taken it to a new level within the state, and really giving, I think, more people of color a voice, which has been very impactful.
Stan, how about you? What do you think?
Yeah, this is a loaded one. I mean, we could probably spend a whole hour just talking about this issue. And, you know, in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd, I had an all-staff Zoom to talk about it. And, you know, my message was kind of a pessimistic one. I was not optimistic that anything would come of it, because we had been here before, right? You had Eric Garner's death in Staten Island, choked to death because he was selling Lucy cigarettes, and we had protests and we marched. And at the end of the day, everybody just went back to work. You had Michael Brown in Missouri, you had Mr. Page in Baltimore. I mean, there were riots, there were fires, outrage, and then we all just went back to the same. And, you know, early on, I was not optimistic that this moment would be any different. But a month later, I had another staff meeting, and you know, this moment is different. This is a racial awakening. You saw every Fortune 500 company putting out statements in support of Black Lives Matters. You had politicians, right, middle, and left, talking about Black Lives Matters. Murals were being painted. Corporate America was putting their money where their mouth is. I think Bank of America pledged like $100 billion, you know, for racial justice and racial equity in the NFL and the NBA. I mean, it's just, I could just go on and on and on. And so, it certainly is a moment that we have to seize. And I think, in our profession, we have to do two things. One, we have to look internally, right? Look at our own offices internally. We had staff-led conversations around race in the office, microaggressions, treatment in court, how we communicate, who gets promoted, who doesn't get promoted, right? So I think internally, we all have to do that incredibly important work. And I think externally, as a profession, right, we have to bring all of our different sections, right? If we're talking about the ABA, together to work toward dismantling institutional racism. So, I am leading a national task force on racial equity for the National Legal Aid and Defender Association. And what makes it so unique is that we have defenders on this task force. We have civil legal aid on this task force. We have clients on this task force, and we have corporate partners. So we have a couple of major Fortune 500 companies, Hewlett Packard and Pfizer, also coming together to figure out how we can make permanent and systemic changes that we need to address. And so I would challenge, the ABA to say, hey, let's bring the criminal justice section and the corporate section together, right? And the government section together, because we all have different perspectives on this issue. We all have different expertise. And if we're really going to go at this, we can't do it in a siloed fashion, right? Because it's not just a criminal justice issue, but as we saw with COVID-19, right, it was access to healthcare. As we've seen with education, it's access to Wi-Fi and to remote learning, and who has the ability to engage and spend hours with their child, making sure that they're learning in a remote world. So I think it's all been exposed. And I think that the approach has to be a unified one.
Absolutely agree. AJ, I want to turn to a little bit of a conversation that, you and I, we're chiefs, we're white allies, and what our role. And when you look, by the way, let's sort of talk about the reality of our profession. When you look at many of the chiefs across this country, both, I would believe, in both the state system and in the federal public defender system, we are white. We play a role here as allies. Talk about that a little bit in your work in the federal defender system. Are these conversations happening? Where are we going, and what should we be doing to elevate and support our communities of color, our staff of color, and our fellow chiefs of color across the country?
Yeah, I mean, there's a tremendous, first of all, I want to say I thank you to Cydni and Stan, because I agree with everything they said. There's a tremendous underrepresentation of people of color in the managerial ranks, the heads of offices, just like in corporate America, and most of government. There's a tremendous underrepresentation, and I think as heads of offices, you have to work to try to do something about that. And that when I first came into the federal system, it was an all-white system, all-white male system, believe me. And it took a long time to start to get incremental change in that. There has been, in the past few years, a real renewed emphasis on both women and people of color to try to get them. There were also very few women heads of federal defender offices. And the AO, the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts, our oversight body, had the same problem. And there has been a tremendous push, I think, in the last few years to try to remedy that. And I think that hopefully with this renewed conversation, that, as I am too wary, like Stan says, that it happens and then we go back to work, that this time it really is happening. And as directors of agencies, you have to be in the forefront of that to make sure that people of color are in line to be promoted to positions and to take over agencies. So I think that's very important. And I just, can I say one more thing? The biggest thing that I think, well, two things. One is our clients are finally, I think, being heard, not only heard, but believed. I mean, I've been in the system for a long time, and you always heard they jumped out of the police car, grabbed me, threw me up against the wall, searched me. You know, there was not, and nobody would, you know, they would come into court and tell a different story, and the judges would never believe a defendant and would always believe the police, the officers, and or things like, you know, I had $1,000 on me, the police only reported 500, things like that, and search warrants and how the basis for them. I think finally the stories of our clients are being heard and believed, and I think that that's an extremely good thing. But I'm a little more wary maybe than even Stan. All the what I've seen of the discussions about reforming the police around the country, there's a lot of initial energy for it, and then it starts to get bogged down in the details that I've seen in people about the funding, and I just hope that people will keep up the movement to reform that. But I'm a little more pessimistic about the actual how that will happen.
I think there's a level of demand, or just let me just say, there is a demand by, I think, the folks that are coming into our profession for us to do more, to tackle both internally and externally, to sort of live by an anti-racist value, but not just say it, but to act on it in an intentional way. And I do think for all of us who have been practicing for a really long time, that it means we have to shift. Many people came to our profession because they loved litigation, and that's not to say that the folks coming now don't love litigation, but they also love the social justice element of this work. And as chiefs, particularly those of us who are white, making sure we are passing the mic, developing and allowing for us to be guided, and the work that we be guided by those values, by people who want to come to our profession and develop our work, is incredibly exciting. Also, though, a challenge, right? Because I want to sort of take a moment to sort of pivot a little bit to say, I was recently, after January 6th and the stuff that was happening, AJ, in your neck of the woods in DC, there's and certainly there was the terrible shooting that happened in Atlanta, and sort of the calls for hate crime legislation in the wake of continued violence against BIPOC communities. There was a conversation, and I saw a tweet on Twitter about one of the people being arrested in the January 6th, connection to the January 6th incident, saying that they should not get a public defender, or that they shouldn't be released on bail. And I hear a cry from people who are criminal justice advocates on Twitter calling for hate crime legislation. And here we are in the role of public defenders, who are also equally committed to an anti-racist value and moving that agenda in an intentional way as chiefs. I'm going to turn to you first, AJ, because it's in your neck of the woods. And it is in actually the federal system that I saw this tweet. Can you, obviously, you may be representing some folks, so obviously we do recognize the sensitive nature of that. But can you talk about how you have, and your office has responded to that? And then I want to turn to Stan and Cydni for response on what does this mean and how do we do both? How do we do both? The balance of being an anti-racist profession devoted to ending racism, but also having our constitutional mandate.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot for throwing that to me, Tina. Yeah, I mean, yeah, we do. Our office is actually overwhelmed right now with the cases from the January 6th, when there was a large influx of tourists, and the celebration got a little out of control. But look, you can't. I don't think. I mean, I can't say it more simply than that. To start drawing lines about who should and shouldn't get a public defender, why would we be in this business? Anybody who's accused of a crime who could go to jail is entitled to a public defender. It's interesting. You know, there's been some very terrible crimes recently, events, terrible shootings and going back. And all of a sudden, I don't know why the Capitol, the events at the Capitol gave rise to this. I'll tell you, I mean, I got an email that, and I won't tell you the client or anything, but it said, I'm a very liberal person who lives in California and I'm adamantly opposed to the death penalty, but I hope your client dies very soon. So it's things like that that, you know, where do you draw the line on that? There's no, once you start going down, it's way too slippery a slope. Not that I think there's any line at all. It's very clear to me. And, you know, then there's the whole thing, you're absolutely right about, as my personal views to my professional view. There's the whole thing, you know, in the ABAs and opposition to over-criminalization. And where do we draw the line on that too? On a personal level, I couldn't agree with you more. On a professional level, it's a whole different thing. And, you know, and we're in the bizarre role in the federal system, especially, but in others, of being the biggest advocates of the Second Amendment when our clients are charged with gun crimes. You know, personally, do I believe what I'm, not believe is not the right word, but personally, would I push that agenda as opposed to professionally? So we're in these dilemmas all the time. They actually come out very simply to me. Everybody's entitled to a lawyer. I don't defend people or not. If you're a public defender, you defend people accused of crimes. And that's the bottom line. And I think that I would hope that people understand that. But you're right, but it's hard to say that because we are representing people in the thing, and you can't make a lot of public statements you would like to make. So,
yeah, thank you, thanks, Stan, and then
yeah,
Cydni.
Tina, I think, I mean, you know, we all on the Zoom are of a different generation, right? We are similar in our thinking about the work and the people we represent, to AJ's position. But I think as the head of an office, it's balancing the expectations of my younger staff, who, like you pointed out, kind of view this work as kind of civil rights work and kind of expect us to kind of put out statements condemning all kinds of issues and hate and violence, especially when it's directed toward minority organizations. And so, you know, for me, in the context of George Floyd, that was a policing issue, right? It was a death at the hands of law enforcement. You know, we call out policing and law enforcement all of the time. But I'll be honest that I've struggled with the situation in Atlanta, where we're talking about, you know, the violence and the treatment of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. But that's at the hand of other citizens that in New York City are going to end up being our clients, right? So I checked yesterday. We have 3 current cases where our clients are being accused of kind of like hate crimes against Asian Americans. And so how do I balance my obligation to those clients if I'm also putting out a statement condemning the violence that they're accused of doing? And, I don't have an answer. We're dealing with this internally and how we kind of balance it. But, I'll share a story that, we had an attorney who was representing a white supremacist, right? Absolute white supremacist, one of these groups that we've heard about in the news lately. And I had a conversation with the attorney, and I just found it fascinating that this is an attorney, give this person a homicide or rob one or rape one, and they're rolling up the sleeves and they're all in. And I could see that they were struggling, like emotionally, internally, with the representation of this person, because I think they somehow felt that it maybe went counter to this larger conversation around racial justice, and we're racial justice fighters. And we just have to protect against that. Like our role, I've told people for 25 years, I'm not in the judging business. That's not what I do. I do not judge individuals. I fight and represent them in court. And so I don't have answers for anyone who's listening, but I think it's a conversation that if you're the head of an office, you have to balance this generational shift and figure out how we're going to thread this needle.
Thanks. Cydni, what do you think? What's your thoughts on this?
What came to mind actually was that we, I think, as a group, as leaders, have done a disservice to our employees of color, and specifically our attorneys. This is not something they teach you in law school, these difficult conversations, right? And representing a white supremacist when you're a person of color is not anything anybody ever teaches you or even walks you through how to talk through and communicate with a client who hates you, right? Just from when you're walking into the room, and develop a rapport and get to the facts of the case, and then the emotional aspect on top of that. And so I don't think that I have never heard of a program or a training program. And I say that as I oversee training. We're trying to pinpoint all these things that law school and the profession does not prepare you for in indigent defense. And this is one of those things. So now that I'm saying this out loud, I certainly need to find a way to provide this, but it is a real problem that we do not prepare our attorneys for.
Yeah. And it layers onto that trauma that we talked about in the wake of COVID, in the exhaustion of workload, and for particularly our staff of color and our core staff in particular that feel that isolation. This has been an extraordinarily challenging year for all of this. And really, you are so right in that we have to, I think, and I've been thinking, we invest a lot in training to litigate and very little about how to feel through that litigation and what it means. And as to the role of that we play as the public defender, I think all of us in leadership should be having these conversations, both as in fact as leaders, but also with our teams about that balance you're talking about, Stan. And I would say that even the American Bar Association, NLADA, the National Association for Public Defense, all of our professional organizations, both nationally and locally, we should be engaging in these conversations as a whole, to figure out what our messaging is, how we uplift this work and the importance of this work, and uplift both the fundamental principle of everybody deserves a lawyer and a great one, as well as how we continue to push for a truly a profession that comes comes from the value of being anti-racist. There's a question. We have 10 minutes. So there is a question in here. So do you think the lawyers of color should be able to ask to have someone else represent the person who's charged with white supremacy or with a white supremacist act or hate crime?
Well,
Panelists?
absolutely not. I think it's what Cydni just spoke about, right? Like, I think we have to prepare all our lawyers, right, and train them to be able to deal when they find themselves in this situation. But we can't, under any circumstances, in my opinion, allow, public defenders and our staff to kind of pick and choose who are the clients that they want to represent. I mean, if this is a kind of systemic issue with a person, then you're kind of in the wrong office.
Other thoughts on this, on this take?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Stan, although I'm torn personally, to be honest with you, and I'll tell you why, but I agree with Stan. If you're a public defender, you're a public defender. If you're a private lawyer, you can pick and choose your clients. But what we do is defend people accused of crimes, and that's all we do, and that's what we do, and they're individual clients in individual cases. On the other hand, I am torn. If there is a lawyer who's uncomfortable representing someone, or there's a client who's vehemently opposed to having, and the last thing you want to do is accommodate that racism or sexism or whatever it might be, prejudice against the community. And so but I'm concerned because people are going to jail in the federal system for 20 or 30 years with the blink of an eye, and it's you don't want to have somebody who is having a terrible experience with their lawyer get in that situation. But as a general principle, we refuse to accommodate that because of what Stan referred to. You just be perpetuating the racism or the other prejudices from that. So, but I'm a little, I sometimes am a little uncomfortable, but I come back to, we're public defenders, that's what we do.
I don't know if you have anything to add to this, Cydni.
The only thing I would add is I, of course, agree with everything they're saying. I agree we came to this work. We don't get to pick our clients. But of course, the other part of me is thinking, right, the stress of the work is overwhelming. And that is just right, with a regular caseload, with a very full caseload. And then adding these emotional pieces on top is often puts people to their breaking point, and why we see so much attrition, because it's overwhelming. The manager in me wants to say, right, this will make you a better attorney in the long term, right? Being able to work through this with the client, and but the emotional toll and the stress, is something that we just, again, need to better train or support or give them a second chair that can kind of help navigate with them. I think if we do that, then at least we're providing additional support so they can be successful.
Yeah. So much of today was this sort of conversation about the balance, right? How do you balance work life? How do you balance the sort of need for the safety in the courtroom because of COVID versus due process? How do you balance all of these things that we're constantly assessing? And I think this is one of them, which is I want to agree to. I want to say to all of you, absolutely, this is the role of a public defender. But I do worry that if someone, right, if someone is uncomfortable, if as a practitioner you are so uncomfortable with your representation, at what point, right, implicitly, not that anybody would tank a case on purpose, but implicit bias plays in such an enormous role. And if you're not gelling with your client, you're not building that relationship. So much of our work is about the relationship. And if there's inhibition to that, how do we, and again, it comes down to Cydni, exactly what you're saying, training, discussion, support mechanisms, mentorship, second sharing, because if you can't build that relationship because you are inhibited by what the person's act was, perhaps if it was to a member of your own community, that may inhibit the practice. All to say that it is really difficult, and we are at a pivotal point in public defense to take these conversations to a different level. And I stand to your task force. I think that's the way to go. You have to make space around the table, to the ABA, to the Women in, I'm going to give a shout out to the Women in Criminal Justice Task Force, where I met, where I got to meet Cydni for the first time in New Mexico. I think we have to talk about the role of women in our profession, particularly women of color in our profession that are leaders. And then to the allies, AJ, you and I, and the many chiefs that are white, to say, what is our role? And going into, I think, coming out of COVID, whatever that means, and leaning into the national, the recognition that we can't step back from continuing to demand racial justice is one that I think public defenders lead in a particular space. And I want to thank the panelists. I want to check and see if there are any more questions from our audience. Okay, we have 3 minutes. Let's just do a quick round. Last final words. Cydni, I'll start with you.
Wow, final last words. The one thing that I would add as final last words is you had asked about how we tackle racism and how white chiefs and white colleagues can support people of color. I just wanted to say, right, we say give people the opportunity to elevate their voice, but I wanted to say it's important that everybody listens. I can talk all day to you, to my chief, to whoever, but unless somebody's actually listening and there's some accountability to make changes and to act on it, then it doesn't do any good for me to have a voice. So that's what I would end with. Thank you very much, Tina.
AJ, how about you?
Thanks, Tina. And yes, absolutely, Cydni. You're absolutely right. But one other thing I hope that this leads to is there's also a big discussion, and part of it is attributable to COVID, and another huge part of it is attributable to the terrible racism of the system, of the mass incarceration and over-incarceration. And I'm very hopeful that something will come of that in the near future to stop this terrible, Virginia, just yesterday, or I think it was just yesterday, the governor of Virginia signed a bill to abolish the death penalty in Virginia, which had been second to Texas in executing people. So I have hope that there's a movement for reform, and I hope that mass incarceration, which particularly hits people, communities of color, extremely disproportionately, I hope that will continue.
Stan, bring us home.
So I'll just end with, Tina already stated how, white the leadership of public defender offices is nationwide. I mean, there's just a dearth of Black public defender leaders. And I challenge all the public defender leaders to take corrective action. And a shout out to New York City. All 6 public defenders came together. We put resources together and we reached out to the Black Public Defenders Association. We worked with them to develop a leadership training specifically for Black public defenders to kind of start training and preparing the next generation of public defender leaders. And there's work you can do to really make affirmative steps to make sure that, when we all retire, that there are Black public defenders in the pipeline to fill these positions.
And on that, we will use that as our call to bring it forward. I want to thank thank the three of you for what I knew was going to be a great conversation. We got it. We should have took a bet, but we did do it in an hour. And we weren't sure that we would. But I think that this is a start of a conversation for our profession, for the ABA, for NLADA, for all the national and local bar associations as well, and for all of us as chiefs to continue to uplift Gideon, support our staff, and really step into the breach when our clients need us most. Thank you. Stay safe. Be well, friends. And next time in person.
Thank you. So
Thank
long, everyone.
you.